This video is sponsored by Connell Guides. To get your hands on the most intelligent study guides on the market for GCSE and A-level English literature, as well as GCSE and A-level history, visit connellguides.com and use code RS15 at checkout for 15% off your order.
How is the theme of gender presented in William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet? Let's find out.
How's it going, Revision Squad? DystopiaJunkie here with another English literature revision video for you. And in this one, we're going to be focusing on how the theme of gender is presented in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. If you've watched any of my other Romeo and Juliet revision videos, you will be familiar with the structure of this one. We are going to start by breaking down what the theme of gender means in relation to Shakespeare's play. Then we're going to work our way through analysing 10 quotations that are relevant to our theme. Then at the end I will pose a big question for you to think about and, if you're feeling brave enough, answer in the comments section down below. My aim here is to help you out as you study or revise Shakespeare's play. If I am successful in doing that, please do let me know. You could give this video a like, write a lovely comment on it, share it around with anybody else who might benefit from watching it, and, of course, you could subscribe to my channel too if you haven't done so already. Alright, so if this video is about the theme of gender in Romeo and Juliet, just what exactly does this mean, and which contextual information might be helpful to know? Gender is very complex. As a term, it relates to a set of socially constructed identity characteristics and the norms, behaviours and roles associated with these. Gender influences how people view and act within themselves, how they interact with people with whom they share a gender, and how they interact with people whose gender differs from their own. Now, although I acknowledge, accept and agree that gender exists across a spectrum, bringing this understanding of gender to Romeo and Juliet would be somewhat anachronistic, for gender was generally viewed in more binary terms in Shakespeare's time. As such, when thinking about the theme of gender in Romeo and Juliet, we are often looking at presentations of masculinity and femininity, and how characters uphold or subvert the norms, behaviours and roles associated with these characteristics. In other words, what does it mean to be a manly man or a womanly woman in Shakespeare's play, and what does it look like when men and women decide to not act like this? To begin to think about those questions and how they relate to Romeo and Juliet, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going over some important contextual information. I'd say sorry for not getting to quotation analysis straight away, but this is also super essential information and will underpin the analysis I'll get to in just a little bit. Remember that understanding how a text relates to its contexts is a super important aspect of your literary studies, and demonstrating this knowledge will be key to helping you get those top grades. So what traits were considered masculine in Shakespeare's time? Power was considered a masculine trait because Elizabethan England was generally patriarchal in nature, a word meaning led by men. This power manifested itself politically, economically, socially and physically, and men tended to use this power to oppress women and keep the patriarchy in place. Now, given the physical manifestation of this power, violence was also considered a typically masculine trait in Elizabethan England. Moreover, this extended to sexual violence. Now, this isn't to say that men were assaulting women constantly in Shakespeare's time, just that sexual violence was most often regarded as something that men did to women rather than the other way round. Such power may have also translated to other typically masculine behaviours. Arrogance, bravado, a word meaning a show of boldness designed to impress or intimidate, and machismo, a word meaning excessive male pride, were viewed as typically male behaviours. Moreover, men were expected to be strong emotionally, and so tears, sadness, those sorts of things were considered unmasculine. Now, for men in Shakespeare's time, their most important relationships were not those they had with women, but those they had with their fellow man. This is because they were relationships made out of choice that were free of the expectations that came with marriage or familial relationships. In these relationships, men were emotionally and intellectually intimate and showed deep devotion to each other. As such, male loyalty was an important masculine characteristic, and upholding it was absolutely crucial. And what about femininity? Well, given the patriarchal nature of Elizabethan England and the oppression that came with this, women were generally treated as second-class citizens in Shakespeare's time. Now, I'm sure you know that women weren't allowed to perform on stage because acting was considered uncouth and corrupting. However, women also had reduced legal and economic rights in Shakespeare's time because they were in potestate maritorum, or subject to the absolute power of their husbands. As such, any profits that were gained by their property went straight to their husbands, and women could not write a will without his consent. Women's importance lay mostly in their roles within the home or family. They were daughters, then wives, and then mothers. As patriarchal daughters, women had to listen and obey the decision made by their fathers on the issue of their marriage, as well as any other commands they might have made. As wives, women were expected to do what their husbands told them to do, much like how their fathers would have treated them. Importantly, women, as wives, were expected to get pregnant and have babies, which then, as a mother, they would have been expected to raise. Femininity was not equal to complete powerlessness in Elizabethan England though. Although subject to their husband's power in many regards, contemporary accounts suggest that women had, for the most part, all the charge of the house and household, thus suggesting that the domestic sphere was a place where femininity had greater power. So as you can see, there were some very rigid gender roles and gender divisions in Shakespeare's time, but that does not mean that these were completely unchallenged. Let's begin with an obvious contextual factoid. Queen Elizabeth I was the ruling monarch when Romeo and Juliet was produced. As such, the notion that power was an exclusively masculine trait was challenged in Shakespeare's time. Gender binaries were also often challenged by cross-dressing in Shakespeare's time. This would of course have been seen on stage, for old men or boys would have worn women's clothing in order to play female characters. Now this queering of gender would have been complicated further in instances in Shakespeare plays where female characters dress up as male characters, because you would have had men dressing as women dressing as men. However, such cross-dressing was not just something that occurred only on the stage. In Shakespeare's time, there were lots of examples of women dressing up as men. Now this was quite liberating for women who were freed from patriarchal expectations when cross-dressing, but this was also most often seen in more illicit and shady settings. The last subversion of gender norms in Elizabethan England that I'm going to talk about is the figure of the Petrarchan lover. Now I've mentioned this concept already in my videos about Romeo and the theme of love, but simply put, a Petrarchan lover was a type of man who was quite gushing and over-emotional when it came to romance. Rather than seeing marriage as a necessity, Petrarchan lovers adored the women they loved and would dote on them in a way that was atypical for men in Shakespeare's time. Okay, I appreciate that that was a lot of contextual information, but I hope you will see throughout this video why most of it was pretty essential for me to mention. Overall, we can see that although there were fixed gender roles and distinctions in Shakespeare's time, these were sometimes subverted and challenged. As such, gender would have been quite an interesting topic for Shakespeare to play around with in his play, as he would have been able to explore what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine, and what it means to push against the historical norms associated with these characteristics. So then, with all of this contextual knowledge in place, which quotations are especially relevant to the theme of gender in Romeo and Juliet? To begin, let's look at a handful of lines said by Samson, one of the Capulet's servants, in the play's opening scene. Spying some Montague servants, he says to Gregory, another Capulet servant, "'Tis true, and therefore women, being the weaker vessels, are ever thrust to the wall. Therefore I will push Montague's men from the wall, and thrust his maids to the wall." So these 4 lines are relevant to the theme of gender for 3 reasons. To begin, the comparative adjective weaker mirrors the patriarchal nature of Elizabethan England by establishing a gender hierarchy. The fact that Samson so casually asserts women's supposed inferiority suggests that such views might be the norm, at least for men to hold, in Shakespeare's play. Second, the verb push in Push Montague's Men from the Wall creates the impression that male characters are violent in Shakespeare's play, given that Samson appears eager to harm, assault, or otherwise get into some form of physical confrontation with the Montague servants. You could even say that this impression is strengthened by the strong modal verb will, which suggests that Samson is determined to assault the Montague servants and is completely confident in his ability to do so. Last, let's consider the repetition of the phrase thrust to the wall, which Samson says in relation to the Montague maids, the young female servants who are employed by the family. There are obvious sexual connotations to the verb thrust, whereas the deictic expression to the wall suggests that this will be forceful and aggressive. As such, thrust to the wall suggests that Samson intends to sexually assault the Montague maids, an impression reinforced by how he states he will take their maidenheads or virginities only lines later. Because Samson repeats the phrase thrust to the wall, his strong intent to assault the Montague maidens is highlighted. Overall then, this phrase relates to the theme of gender because it not only suggests that women are viewed as sexual objects by men, but because it also suggests that men are responsible for committing sexual violence. Remaining in the same scene, let's have a look at a couple of lines said by Lady Capulet when her husband tries to enter the battle that has seemingly erupted from nowhere. After asking for his sword, she replies, a crutch, why call you for a sword? So with the theme of gender in mind, you could argue that this quotation suggests that men are foolish and women are sensible. Why does this quotation present men as foolish? Well, Lady Capulet's repetition of the noun phrase a crutch sees her point out the fact that her husband is too old or infirmed to walk without assistance, and so his desire to join in with the fighting seems foolish because he is clearly in no fit state to contribute to the violence. This effect is of course reinforced by her follow-up question, which sees her bring into doubt his desire to fight. Now, because Lady Capulet points out her husband's foolishness, we could say that she, and by extension women, given that she is representing women in this exchange, is sensible. Again, if you wanted a short quotation to back up this point, either half of this one will do, as they both see her act as the voice of reason that counterbalances her husband's foolishness. Next, let's consider a few lines that the nurse says when conversing with Lady Capulet. Recalling something her now dead husband said to Juliet when the young Capulet was only 3 years old, the nurse quotes, "Yea," quoth he, "dost thou fall upon thy face? Thou wilt fall backward that thou hast more wit, wilt thou not, Jule?" Now this might seem like a silly, whimsical, if not slightly mean-spirited story about Juliet falling over as a small child and the nurse's husband laughing about it. But these 3 lines in fact reveal that women are sexualized and treated as sex objects in Shakespeare's play. Quoting her husband, the nurse juxtaposes face and backward to state that although Juliet might fall forwards in her infancy, when she is older she will be more inclined to fall backward, a euphemistic reference to Juliet having sex. The fact that the nurse's husband can joke about this so openly, and the fact that the nurse herself so freely brings it up again, suggests that it is quite normal for men and women to speak about women as if they are potential sex objects, regardless of their age. Further to the juxtaposition between face and backward, the phrase more wit also suggests that women are viewed as potential sex objects in Shakespeare's play. Although this may seem like a harmless comment about Juliet becoming more clever as she grows up, the noun wit was a euphemism for penis in Shakespeare's time, and so the nurse's husband's assertion about Juliet having more wit can be interpreted as him talking about how she will have sex with many men when she is older. Again, this suggests to me that women are viewed as potential sex objects in the play, which of course relates to how women were viewed in Shakespeare's time, for once they progressed from being daughters, they became wives and mothers, individuals whose identities centered around their ability to procreate. Remaining in the same scene, let's have a look at a short line Lady Capulet says when trying to tell Juliet that she ought to think about getting married. That line is, "I was your mother much upon these years." Now this is a nice and straightforward one. When Lady Capulet says that she was Juliet's mother much upon these years, she means that when she was Juliet's age, she was already married and had given birth to Juliet. As such, Lady Capulet is presented as a traditional Elizabethan woman because she has conformed to the gender roles of wife and mother that are expected of her. The fact that she states this to persuade Juliet to consider marrying Paris reinforces the impression that Lady Capulet is a traditional Elizabethan woman, for she is trying to instill the same traditional values in her daughter. Speaking of characters who conform to the behaviours expected of them, let's have a look at a couple of lines said by Mercutio, which I think depict him as a typically masculine character. Those lines are, "If love be rough with you, be rough with love. Prick love for pricking, and you beat love down." Why do I think these lines present Mercutio as being typically masculine? To begin to get to that answer, let's deconstruct what he is actually saying here. In short, Mercutio is telling Romeo to not get too down and defeated by love. If love is rough with him, he should be rough in response. If love pricks him, he should prick it back, and he should also beat love down and assert his dominance. In other words, Romeo should show love who the boss is. Already, we could say that these lines present Mercutio as being typically masculine for two reasons. First, the words rough, prick, and beat all bear violence connotations, and we know that violence was seen as a typically male characteristic in Shakespeare's time, and so using this language could characterise him as being a stereotypically masculine character. Second, by being somewhat dismissive of Romeo's overly romantic behaviour, telling his friend to show love who is the boss, rather than embracing the romantic feelings he feels, we see that Mercutio is not particularly romantic himself, thus exhibiting a sort of unfeeling attitude towards love that was seen as typically male in Shakespeare's time. However, there is one final reason why I think these lines present Mercutio as a typically masculine character. Let's revisit the words rough, prick, and beat. Yes, all of those words do bear violence connotations, as I said just a moment ago, but they also bear sexual connotations too. In these lines, Mercutio is therefore using double entendre to speak in a somewhat bawdy way, thus demonstrating a sort of laddish banter that could be considered typical of the bravado that was often associated with men in Shakespeare's time. So then, these two lines present Mercutio as typically male because they bear violent, unfeeling, and sexual connotations. In my mind, Mercutio more or less represents masculinity in Romeo and Juliet, so if you're after some additional quotations that could relate to this theme, and masculinity more specifically, I recommend you check out my video about this character, a link for which should be appearing in the top corner about now. Alright, let's move forwards into Act 2. With the theme of gender in mind, I want to take a look at 3 lines Juliet says in the colloquially named balcony scene. And those lines are, "Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or, if thou wilt not, be but sworn, my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet." So in these lines we can see how Juliet begins to subvert gender roles. This is first suggested by the top line of this quotation, for the doubled imperative, deny thy father and refuse thy name, sees Juliet attempt to command an imagined Romeo, thus exerting power over a man in a way that would not have been typical for Shakespeare's time, especially when it came to the topic of marriage, for women were expected to be docile when it came to these matters. Second, let's look at what Juliet is actually saying in these lines. In telling Romeo to refuse thy name, she's telling him to abandon his Montague surname, presumably so he can join her and become a Capulet instead. Only after proposing this solution first does Juliet offer to no longer be a Capulet and leave her own family behind. As such, we can see that Juliet is trying to subvert gendered marriage norms, for she is asking Romeo, a man, to leave behind his family and become absorbed within Juliet's, a woman's, family, which is precisely the opposite of how marriage conventions functioned in Shakespeare's time. A woman was supposed to leave her family and become absorbed within her husband's. Overall then, we see that Juliet begins to subvert gender roles by attempting to assert dominance over a male figure and ask him to, through marrying her, leave his family. Next, let's have a look at something Mercutio says to Tybalt shortly after Romeo turns down his request for a duel, which is, "Will you pluck your sword out of his pilcher by the ears?" So with the theme of gender in mind, why have I selected this quotation? I would say that this quotation sees Shakespeare dramatise male loyalty, which he locates in the character of Mercutio. By asking if Tybalt will pluck his sword from its scabbard, this quotation makes it clear that Mercutio is challenging him to a fight. This exemplifies male loyalty because it shows that Mercutio is looking to defend Romeo's honour, which ultimately would have been threatened when Romeo refused to fight Tybalt, as a man's honour would have been wrapped up in his bravery and willingness to accept invitations to duel during Shakespeare's time. By more or less asking to fight in Romeo's place, we can see the extent of Mercutio's loyalty for him, because he would happily defend his friend's honour, even if that means putting his own life at risk. As a quick side note, I think it's also interesting how Mercutio personifies Tybalt's sword as male, as seen in the possessive pronoun his. Is this Shakespeare's way of reinforcing the association between masculinity and violence that he has evoked throughout his play? Okay, let's stay thinking about masculinity for our next quotation. Rather than look at stereotypical presentations of masculinity though, let's look at something that challenges those expectations. After fighting Tybalt, Romeo runs to Friar Lawrence. The friar tells him that he has been exiled for murdering Tybalt, which brings Romeo to tears. Upon seeing this, Friar Lawrence remarks, "Thy tears are womanish." So what's this got to do with gender? First, this short quotation shows us that Romeo subverts typical notions of masculinity because the noun tears shows that he makes outward displays of emotion, which, as Friar Lawrence expresses by using the adjective womanish, would have been more typically associated with femininity in Shakespeare's time. Moreover, because Romeo is crying about his exile, which means he will be separated from Juliet, you could even argue that this adds to his overall presentation as a typical Petrarchan lover. This is because his sadness is not caused by death or injury, but, indirectly I suppose, is instead caused by a girl, or his feelings for one. Because Romeo is so easily swayed by his feelings for Juliet, we could begin to characterise him as a Petrarchan lover, which, as I said earlier in this video, would have been viewed as quite an atypical attitude for a man to take. Second, I would like to return to Friar Lawrence's association of sadness with femininity. By asserting that Romeo's tears are womanish, we see that the male figure is attempting to reinforce gender stereotypes, perhaps so as to threaten Romeo's honour so much that he snaps to his senses. Although I don't think there's much in the way of deep analysis that you could do here, I do think it's interesting that Friar Lawrence is one of the many characters in Shakespeare's play who expects that gender stereotypes are upheld. Furthermore, by almost criticising Romeo in this way, we could even argue that Friar Lawrence enforces what we might today call toxic masculinity, because his assertion implies that he does not think it is fitting for a man to feel or express his emotions. For our penultimate quotation, let's look at Lord Capulet's reaction to Juliet insisting that she will not marry Paris, which is, "Out, you green sickness carrion! Out, you baggage, you tallow face!" I hope that is pretty clear that Lord Capulet is incandescent with rage in these lines. His list of 3 insults and the trio of exclamation marks makes this pretty clear, I think. But why exactly is he angry? At face value, he is angry at Juliet for refusing to marry Paris. By rejecting her parents' authority over her life, and her love life in particular, Juliet subverts the gender norms of Elizabethan England. Consequently, we can see that challenging the expectations associated with gender can be a cause for alarm, distress, or upset in Shakespeare's play. However, I think more or less every student is going to talk about how Lord Capulet's anger relates to Juliet's subversion of femininity, and you lot are here for that extra spicy, more interesting analysis, aren't you? Well, in which case, let's take a moment to think about what Juliet's subversion of femininity means for Lord Capulet as a masculine figure. Based on the context we discussed earlier, we know that men were generally more powerful in Shakespeare's time, and we know also that women were supposed to be subservient to men, in particular their fathers, and then once married their husbands. Consequently, we know that an important masculine characteristic in Elizabethan England was for men, as patriarchal fathers, to dictate their daughters' marital arrangements. As such, by refusing to marry Paris, Juliet not only subverts the expectations placed upon her as a patriarchal daughter, but she challenges the expectations placed upon her father, who, unable to give her away to Paris, fails as a man. As such, I wonder if Lord Capulet's anger is not just because he is frustrated or shocked by Juliet's subversion of femininity, but is instead caused by him feeling that his masculinity has been threatened or challenged. Okay, now it is time to look at our final quotation with the theme of gender in mind. Now, I could have talked about the "Oh happy dagger" quotation and how this shows Juliet completely subverting gender norms by taking full control of her situation. But I've done that quotation to death, if you'll excuse the pun, in lots of my other videos in this series, and I'm not sure it adds much to our analysis of gender based on what we have said elsewhere in this video. Instead, I'm going to pick another quotation from the play's final scene, which I think adds an interesting idea that relates to this theme. That quotation, uttered by Friar Lawrence, is, "Come, I'll dispose of thee among a sisterhood of holy nuns." As I'm sure you know, Friar Lawrence says this to Juliet when she has woken up, and once he has realised that the plan to reunite her with Romeo has gone terribly wrong. Although the verb dispose begins to suggest that the friar is just trying to think on his feet and save Juliet from being discovered by the soon to arrive guards, I want to pay closer attention to his actual solution. He says he will dispose of Juliet among a sisterhood of holy nuns, presumably meaning that he will take her to a convent where she will take monastic vows and spend the rest of her days as a woman of faith. We know, though, that nuns must take a vow of chastity, meaning that they cannot fall in love, have sex, fall pregnant, and so on. These acts are of course bound up in the expectations placed upon femininity in Shakespeare's time, for women were expected to serve their husbands and provide them with heirs. Because Friar Lawrence decides to take Juliet to a nunnery then, he may be suggesting that because Juliet has subverted the gender expectations placed upon her by refusing the husband her parents have selected for her, she may as well not be a woman, or at the very least she may as well not be feminine, and should instead occupy a sort of genderless, unfeminine yet womanly position in society. Interestingly, this is not the only time in the play where this insinuation is made. At the start of the play, Rosaline rejects Romeo's romantic advances and goes off to become a nun. This suggests that she rejects the expectations placed upon femininity and instead chooses to live a genderless, unfeminine yet womanly position in society. An important distinction between Juliet and Rosaline, however, is choice. Rosaline chooses to become a nun, and in doing so, she actually upholds stereotypes of femininity because this choice reinforces the societal expectation that women in Shakespeare's time generally only had value if they were able to satisfy, please, or otherwise follow their husbands. In Juliet's case, though, it is the friar who attempts to reinforce these norms. It is him who reasserts that women only have value in relation to the men who ostensibly have control over them. Juliet's say in this matter goes unheard, which again sees the friar reinforce gender norms because he has assumed that Juliet is a powerless entity who can be controlled by a male figure. Of course, Juliet implicitly rejects the friar's proposal and, perhaps returning to the "Oh happy dagger" quotation, instead makes her own choice, showing a level of autonomy that would not have been typical for a woman to demonstrate in Shakespeare's time. Of course, there were exceptions to this rule. We have seen throughout the play that Juliet is a female character who holds certain types of power and authority, which may perhaps draw parallels with Queen Elizabeth I, who was, of course, an incredibly powerful and therefore somewhat subversive female figure in Shakespeare's time. As such, is Juliet therefore sort of representing Queen Elizabeth I. Alrighty then, now that I have analysed 10 quotations that relate to the theme of gender, I suppose I ought to start wrapping up this video. But don't stop watching just yet, because if you did, you would miss out on today's big question, which is, does Shakespeare celebrate or demonise gender stereotypes in his play? Does he glorify or condemn the rejection of these stereotypes? What textual evidence informs your opinions? So if you've watched any of my other videos in this series, you will know the drill by now. What you do with this question is completely your choice. You could use it to form the basis of some flashcards or a mind map. You could use it to spark debate among your friends or classmates if you are studying together, or you could even use it to prompt you to write an evaluative paragraph or paragraphs on this topic. And you know where would be a wonderful home for your answer to go? You've got it, the comments section down below. I genuinely love to see the ideas that you lot come up with, so if you're feeling brave enough to share your answer with me, I'll be sure to respect that by giving it a read and some feedback too, so why not give it a go? And with that big question still lingering in your mind, I suppose it is time for me to wrap up this video. Genuinely, I really do hope that you have found this video to be helpful and that you feel a bit more confident when it comes to studying or revising Shakespeare's play as a result of watching it. If this video has indeed helped you out, don't forget to give it a like, write a comment on it to let me know, and share it around with anybody else who might benefit from watching it. And of course, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe to my channel too. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember that, as always, I hope you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be.
So how does Shakespeare present the theme of gender? Well, you could say he presents it in characters who are stereotypically masculine or feminine, such as Mercutio and Lady Capulet. He presents it in characters who want to uphold gender norms, such as Friar Lawrence, but he also presents it in characters who choose to subvert gender expectations, such as Romeo and Juliet.